August 14, 1930, Chicago. At 11 p.m., a small fire that started in the kitchen of St. Mary Children's Hospital on the Southside turned into a raging inferno within 15 minutes. The three-story wooden building was engulfed in flames, and 40 sick children were trapped on the upper floors. The fire department had been called, but the nearest station was 3 kilometers away, and it would take at least 20 minutes to get there at that time of night. Hospital staff were helpless. The stairwells were on fire. The exits were blocked. Children were crying, smoke was rising to the upper floors, and time was running out. But that night, a man sitting in the nearby Green Mill Club saw the smoke through his window. Al Capone thought for 10 seconds, then gathered his men and started running. Nobody knew it, but in that hospital's basement, there was a tunnel entrance that no one remembered. And that night, Chicago's most dangerous man was about to use the most secret asset of his empire to save 40 children's lives. The next day, newspapers would run the headline, "Unidentified heroes save 40 children from death." But the real story would never be written. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, because in upcoming episodes, we'll be telling other extraordinary stories that happened in Al Capone's secret tunnels. The fire starts. A kitchen accident becomes a nightmare. Mary Children's Hospital had been serving Chicago's Southside community since 1912. It wasn't a fancy place, not like the big hospitals downtown. It was a 3-story wooden building that housed sick children from poor families, mostly immigrants who couldn't afford the expensive private hospitals. The staff worked for almost nothing. The equipment was donated, and the building itself was old and needed repairs. But to the families of Southside, St. Mary's was a lifeline. When your child was sick and you had no money, Sister Margaret and her team of nurses would take them in, no questions asked, no payment required. On the night of August 14th, there were 42 children in the hospital. Most had minor illnesses like flu or pneumonia, conditions that were dangerous in 1930 before modern antibiotics, but treatable with rest and care. A few had more serious problems, broken bones, severe infections, post-surgery recovery. The youngest patient was 3-year-old Emma Rossi, who had scarlet fever. The oldest was 15-year-old Michael O'Brien, recovering from a broken leg. All of them were asleep in their beds on the 2nd and 3rd floors when the fire started. The fire began in the kitchen on the 1st floor around 10:50 p.m. The night cook, an elderly woman named Mrs. Chen, had been heating water on the old coal stove to make tea for the night shift nurses. She stepped away for just a moment to get cups from the storage room, and that's when it happened. A kitchen towel hanging too close to the stove caught fire. The flames spread to wooden cabinets, then to the dry wooden walls. Mrs. Chen came back to find the kitchen already filled with smoke and flames licking up the walls. She screamed and ran to find Sister Margaret. Sister Margaret was a 60-year-old nun who had dedicated her life to caring for sick children. When Mrs. Chen found her and told her about the fire, Sister Margaret's first thought was the children upstairs. She immediately began ringing the emergency bell, a loud brass bell that was supposed to alert everyone in the building. Nurses came running from different rooms. Sister Margaret shouted orders. "Get the children from the 2nd floor down immediately. Use the main stairwell." 2 nurses ran upstairs while Sister Margaret grabbed the hospital's only fire extinguisher and rushed to the kitchen. But by the time Sister Margaret reached the kitchen, it was already too late for a fire extinguisher. The entire room was an inferno. Flames had spread to the dining hall next door and were climbing the walls toward the ceiling. The wooden structure of the old building was like kindling, dry and ready to burn. Sister Margaret realized with horror that they had minutes, not hours. She ran back to the main hall and found the 2 nurses she had sent upstairs coming back down with 8 children, carrying the smaller ones, helping the older ones walk. "Where are the others?" Sister Margaret demanded. One nurse, her face covered in soot, cried out, "The main stairwell is blocked. The fire reached it. We can only get to the first section of the 2nd floor. The rest of the 2nd floor and all of the 3rd floor are cut off." 34 children were still trapped upstairs. The main stairwell, the building's primary route between floors, was now a chimney of fire. There was a back stairwell, narrower and older, but when nurses tried to reach it, they found it was also blocked by smoke and flames. The fire was spreading faster than anyone could have imagined, racing through the old wooden building like it was made of paper. Sister Margaret made a desperate decision. She sent one nurse to call the fire department, told another to get the 8 rescued children outside to safety, and then she and 3 other nurses tried to find another way upstairs. They tried windows, looking for a way to climb up the outside of the building, but the walls were too smooth, no handholds. They tried breaking through a wall on the 1st floor to create a new path, but they had no tools, no time. All they could do was stand in the street and watch as smoke poured from the upper windows and children's faces appeared. Crying, screaming for help, Capone seized the smoke. The decision, 3 blocks away. Al Capone was having a quiet evening at the Green Mill Cocktail Lounge. He was sitting in his favorite booth, the one in the corner that gave him a view of both the entrance and the stage. It was a Thursday night, slow for business, and Capone was just having a drink and reviewing some papers with Frank Nitti, his right-hand man. The Green Mill was one of Capone's favorite places in Chicago, a jazz club where he could relax, listen to music, and conduct business in relative peace. The club's owner made sure Capone's booth was always available, and in return, Capone made sure nobody bothered the club. Around 11 p.m., Capone happened to glance out the window and saw something unusual. Orange light in the distance, flickering against the night sky. At first, he thought it might be a bonfire or some kind of celebration, but the light was growing brighter, and now he could see smoke rising. Capone stood up and walked to the window for a better look. The smoke was thick and black, and the flames were visible now, angry and bright. Whatever was burning, it was burning big. Capone turned to one of his men standing nearby and said, "Go find out what's on fire." The man left and came back 5 minutes later, out of breath. "Boss, it's St. Mary's, the children's hospital." "The whole building is on fire." Capone's face changed. He knew St. Mary's. Everyone in Southside knew it. It was where poor families took their sick kids. Capone himself had donated money to the hospital in the past, anonymously of course, because he remembered being a poor kid with nowhere to go when he was sick. "How many kids are in there?" Capone asked. The man shook his head. "I don't know, boss, but I heard people shouting that kids are trapped on the upper floors. Fire department's on the way, but not here yet." Capone was silent for a moment. Everyone in the booth was watching him, waiting to see what he would do. This wasn't Capone's problem. He wasn't a firefighter, wasn't a hero, wasn't someone the public looked to for help. He was a gangster, a criminal, someone half of Chicago wanted to see in jail. Walking toward a burning building would be stupid, dangerous, and wouldn't gain him anything. But Capone was also thinking about something else. He was thinking about St. Mary's location, about the buildings around it, about the old maps he had studied when building his tunnel network. And he was remembering something very specific. St. Mary's had been built on the site of an old warehouse, and that warehouse had been connected to Chicago's freight tunnel system. When St. Mary's was built in 1912, they had kept the old warehouse basement as the hospital's basement, and that basement still had a sealed tunnel entrance. Capone had seen it on maps years ago but had never used it because there was no reason to, until now. Capone made his decision in 5 seconds. He stood up, pulled on his coat, and said to Frank Nitti, "Get Tony, get Sal, get anyone who's here. We're going to St. Mary's." Nitti stared at him. "Boss, why?" "The fire department will handle it." Capone looked at Nitti and said something he rarely said. "Because those are kids, Frank, and I know a way in." Without waiting for a response, Capone walked out of the Green Mill, and 10 of his men followed him into the night. The race against time. Finding the tunnel, Capone and his men ran through the streets of Chicago. An unlikely sight, a gangster in an expensive suit and his crew of tough guys sprinting toward a burning building. When they arrived at St. Mary's, the scene was chaos. The entire building was engulfed in flames, the wooden structure crackling and roaring as fire consumed it. A crowd had gathered, neighbors and passers-by, all standing helpless, watching the horror. Sister Margaret was on her knees in the street, praying and crying. Several nurses were shouting up at the windows, trying to comfort the children they could see trapped inside. The heat was so intense you couldn't get within 20 feet of the building. Capone pushed through the crowd and grabbed Sister Margaret by the shoulders. "How many kids are still inside?" he demanded. Sister Margaret looked up at him with tear-filled eyes. She recognized Capone. Everyone in Chicago knew his face, but she was too desperate to care who he was. 34 children, she sobbed. 2nd and 3rd floors. We can't reach them. The stairs are gone. The fire department isn't here yet. They're going to die." Capone let go of her and turned to his men. "The basement. We need to get to the basement entrance on the east side of the building." The east side of St. Mary's was slightly less engulfed than the front, though flames were already licking at that side too. Capone and 3 of his men ran around to the side, covering their faces with their jackets against the heat and smoke. There, half hidden behind overgrown bushes, was a small metal door at ground level, the kind that led to a basement coal chute. The door was padlocked. Capone's man Tony pulled out a crowbar he had grabbed from a nearby construction site and smashed the lock. The door swung open, revealing a dark stone staircase leading down. Capone didn't hesitate. He grabbed a flashlight from another one of his men and descended into the darkness. The basement was cool and damp, untouched by the fire above. It was full of old hospital supplies, broken furniture, forgotten equipment, Capone swept his flashlight across the room, looking for what he knew had to be there. And then he found it. On the far wall, behind a stack of moldy mattresses, there was a bricked-up archway. This was it. The old tunnel entrance. Capone shouted up to his men, "Get down here! We need to break through this wall!" 4 men came down with the crowbar and started attacking the old brickwork. The mortar was weak, deteriorated by decades of dampness. Bricks came loose quickly. Within 3 minutes, they had created a hole large enough for a man to squeeze through. Capone shined his flashlight into the hole and saw what he had hoped to see, a tunnel stretching into darkness. It was narrow, only about 5 feet high, and it looked like it hadn't been used in 20 years. But it was there and it was intact. Capone turned to his men. This tunnel should lead under the building and come up somewhere in the back section, probably near where the old warehouse loading area used to be. If I'm right, that's under the 2nd floor. We can reach the kids from below, but there was a problem. The tunnel was too small for large men to move quickly through, and even if they reached the 2nd floor from below, they would still need to break through a floor to get to the children. Capone needed more men, more tools, and most importantly, he needed time. Time they didn't have. The building above was collapsing. Every minute more of it burned, more of it weakened. Capone could hear crashes from above as parts of the structure gave way. He turned to Tony and gave rapid orders. "You, run back to the green mill. Get everyone there. Bring crowbars, hammers, anything we can use to break through wood. Tell them to meet us here in 5 minutes or those kids are dead. Go!" Tony ran. Capone and the 3 remaining men entered the tunnel. They had to crouch to fit, and the air was stale and dusty. Capone led the way with his flashlight, moving as fast as the cramped space allowed. The tunnel ran straight for about 50 feet, then turned left. Capone followed the turn and found himself in a slightly larger chamber, probably an old storage area from the warehouse days. Above them, they could hear the fire, a distant roaring sound like an angry beast. The ceiling here was wooden planks, the original floor of the warehouse that had become the floor of St. Mary's basement. Somewhere above those planks were the trapped children. Capone positioned his flashlight to shine on the ceiling and examined the wooden planks. They were old, thick, solid. Breaking through them wouldn't be easy, but it was possible. The question was where to break through. Break through in the wrong spot, and they might end up in a room full of fire instead of children. Capone tried to remember the layout of the building from the times he had visited to drop off donations. The 2nd floor had a long hallway with rooms on either side. If this chamber was where he thought it was, it should be directly under the east wing of the 2nd floor, probably under one of the patient rooms. Capone made his choice. He pointed to a section of the ceiling and said, "We break through here, the impossible rescue, tunnel to safety." The men started attacking the ceiling with the crowbar, smashing at the wooden planks. The wood was old but still strong and progress was slow. After 2 minutes of hard work, they had only made a small crack. Capone was starting to worry they wouldn't make it in time when he heard footsteps in the tunnel behind them. Tony was back, and he had brought 8 more men, all carrying tools. Crowbars, hammers, even a small axe. "Everyone available from the club," Tony reported. "Where do you want us?" With more men and more tools, the work went faster. They attacked the ceiling in shifts, 2 men working while others rested in the cramped space. The wooden planks began to give way, splintering and cracking. After 5 more minutes of brutal effort, they broke through. A hole opened up, and dust and debris fell down on them. Capone shined his flashlight up through the hole and found himself looking into a dark room. He could hear crying, the sound of frightened children somewhere nearby. "We're through!" Capone shouted. "Make the hole bigger!" They widened the hole until it was large enough for a child to fit through. Capone called up into the darkness. "Hey, anyone up there? Don't be scared. We're here to help." For a moment, there was only silence. Then a small voice, trembling with fear. "Who's there?" Capone softened his voice, trying to sound as unthreatening as possible. "My name is Al. I'm here to get you out." "How many kids are up there?" The voice responded, "I don't know. A lot. We're scared." "The fire is outside the door." Capone turned to his men. "We need to get them down through this hole one at a time. Tony, you're the smallest. You go up first and help hand the kids down to us. The rest of you, form a chain. We pass each kid down the tunnel and out to safety. Move fast but be gentle. These are sick kids, scared kids. We don't want to hurt them." Tony nodded and climbed up through the hole, disappearing into the dark room above. A moment later, his face appeared in the hole. "Boss, there's 8 kids in this room. I'm going to start sending them down." The first child to come through the hole was a little girl, maybe 5 years old, wearing a hospital gown and crying. Tony lowered her down gently and Capone caught her. "It's okay, sweetheart, you're safe now," Capone said softly. He handed her to the next man in line, who carried her down the tunnel toward the exit. One by one, children came through the hole. a boy with a bandaged arm, a girl with a fever, burning up and barely conscious, a tiny toddler who was too scared to even cry. Capone caught each one, spoke gently to each one, passed them along the human chain his men had formed. 8 children from that room, all rescued, but there were more children in other rooms. Tony climbed back up and reported, "Boss, I can hear kids crying from the hallway, but I can't get to them. There's too much smoke out there, and I can hear flames. We need to make another hole." Capone looked at the ceiling, trying to judge where the hallway would be. 6 feet to the left, he decided. Break through there. His men moved over and started breaking through another section of ceiling. This time it went faster, because they knew what they were doing. They broke through into the hallway itself. The hallway was filled with thick smoke. Capone could see the orange glow of flames at the far end where the main stairwell had been. The fire was advancing, eating its way down the hall. But between their position and the flames, there were doors, and behind those doors were children. Tony climbed up into the hallway, wrapped a wet cloth around his face that one of the men handed him, and started kicking open doors. The first room had 6 children. He shouted at them, "Come with me! Now, follow me!" The children, some crying, some too shocked to react, stumbled after him. Tony led them to the hole in the floor and started lowering them down to Capone and his men. The second room had 7 children. The third room had 5. Each room added more children to the rescue chain. Capone's men worked like a machine, catching children, carrying them through the tunnel, passing them outside to safety. Outside, the crowd was amazed. Children were emerging from the basement door, dirty and scared but alive, carried by tough-looking men in suits who would set them down gently and then run back inside for more. Sister Margaret couldn't believe what she was seeing. She recognized some of Capone's men from the neighborhood, knew who they worked for, but she didn't care. They were saving her children, but time was running out. The fire had spread down the hallway, and now flames were visible through the smoke. The heat in the hallway was becoming unbearable. Tony was still up there, checking rooms, and he found 3 more children in a room at the end of the hall, the room closest to the flames. He grabbed them and ran back to the hole, the fire literally at his back. He lowered the children down, then jumped down himself, and seconds later, part of the ceiling in the hallway collapsed where he had just been standing. "That's it," Tony gasped. "We got them all from the second floor, but what about the third floor?" Capone had been thinking about this. The third floor was above them, and they couldn't reach it through the tunnel. The only way to the third floor now was from inside the building, up what remained of the back stairwell. It was a suicide mission. The stairs were probably on fire, or about to be, but Capone heard himself saying, "I'll go." His men stared at him. Frank Nitti, who had arrived with the second wave of men, grabbed Capone's arm. "Boss, you can't. You'll die." Capone pulled his arm free. "Those kids are dying right now. I'm going." Into the inferno. The third floor. Capone climbed up through the hole into the hallway. The smoke was so thick he could barely see, and the heat hit him like a physical force. He pulled his jacket over his head, soaked it with water from a bucket one of his men handed up, and started moving down the hall toward the back stairwell. Every breath burned his lungs. His eyes watered from the smoke. He could hear the fire roaring around him, could feel the building shaking as its structure weakened. This was insane. He was going to die here, but his feet kept moving forward. The back stairwell was narrow and dark. The stairs themselves were still intact, not yet touched by fire, but smoke poured down from above. Capone started climbing, feeling his way in the darkness, holding the railing, counting steps. 10 steps, 20 steps. The smoke got thicker with every step. At the top, he found a door. It was hot to the touch, but not yet burning. He pushed it open and found himself on the third floor. The third floor was a nightmare. Smoke everywhere, flames visible through doorways, the wallpaper curling and blackening from heat. Capone could hear children crying, screaming. He shouted, "Where are you? Call out, I'm here to help." Voices responded from different rooms. Capone went to the first door and kicked it open. Inside were 4 children, huddled together in a corner, coughing from smoke. "Come on," Capone yelled. "Follow me, now." He grabbed 2 of them by their hands and pulled them into the hallway. The other 2 followed. Capone led them to the back stairwell, got them started down the stairs, then turned back for more. He found 6 more children in 2 other rooms. Each time the same process. Kick open the door, grab the kids, get them to the stairs. The children were terrified. Some couldn't walk because they were sick, so Capone carried them. A little boy with a broken leg, Capone threw him over his shoulder. A girl who had fainted from smoke, Capone carried her in his arms. He made trip after trip, room to room, down the stairs, back up for more. On his 4th trip, part of the ceiling fell in behind him. Burning debris crashed down, blocking the hallway he had just walked through. The building was coming apart. Capone knew he had maybe 2 more minutes before the whole floor collapsed. He checked the last 2 rooms. One was empty. The other had 3 children, including a teenage boy who was trying to break a window to climb out. "Don't," Capone shouted. "It's 3 stories down. You'll die!" "Come with me." The boy hesitated, then nodded. Capone got the 3 children to the stairs, got them moving down, and then took one last look around. The entire hallway was now on fire. He had gotten them all. At least, he hoped he had. Capone descended the stairs for the last time, his lungs screaming, his vision blurry from smoke. At the bottom, Frank Nitti was waiting, and he grabbed Capone's arm and pulled him toward the basement exit. They ran through the basement, Capone stumbling now, exhausted, and emerged into the cool night air just as a massive crashing sound came from behind them. The 3rd floor had collapsed into the 2nd floor. If Capone had been 30 seconds slower, he would have died in there. The aftermath, unidentified heroes. By the time the fire department arrived, St. Mary's Children's Hospital was a total loss. The building collapsed completely, leaving only a smoldering pile of rubble. But all 42 children had been rescued. Every single one. It was a miracle, everyone said. Sister Margaret stood in the street, surrounded by crying, coughing, but alive children, and she couldn't explain what had happened. She told the fire chief about the men who came from nowhere, who broke through the basement floor, who carried children to safety. She told him about the man who went into the burning building itself to rescue the children from the 3rd floor. But when the fire chief asked who these men were, Sister Margaret realized she didn't know. They had disappeared before she could thank them. The Chicago Tribune sent reporters to cover the fire. The next morning's headline read, "Miracle at St. Mary's. All children saved by unidentified heroes." The article described the rescue, but couldn't identify the rescuers. Sister Margaret was quoted saying, "They appeared like angels and disappeared like ghosts. We owe them the lives of 42 children." The police investigated, interviewing witnesses, but no one could provide names or clear descriptions. Some said the men wore expensive suits. Some said they heard one of them called boss by the others. But no one was certain of anything. Al Capone went home that night, washed the soot and smoke from his face, and went to bed. He didn't tell anyone except his closest men what had happened, and he ordered them to never speak of it. The next day, when reporters came to the Green Mill asking if Capone knew anything about the rescue, the club owner said Mr. Capone had been there all evening and hadn't left. A dozen witnesses supported this lie. Capone himself told reporters, "I heard about the fire. Terrible tragedy. But I don't know anything about who saved those kids. Maybe they were off-duty firefighters. Maybe they were just good people." But in the neighborhood, people whispered. They whispered about the men in suits. They whispered about Al Capone, who was known to frequent the Green Mill, which was only 3 blocks from St. Mary's. They whispered about the tunnel that nobody knew existed, but that somehow these mysterious rescuers had known about and used. The whispers never became proof, never became headlines, but they persisted. And in Little Italy, in Southside, in the poor neighborhoods where Capone had grown up and where his power was strongest, the story became legend. The night Al Capone saved 42 children and asked for nothing in return. The truth behind the legend years later, after Capone was imprisoned, Frank Nitti was questioned by FBI agents about Capone's activities in Chicago. During one of these interrogations, Nitti mentioned the hospital fire. The FBI agents were skeptical, but Nitti provided details that only someone who was there could know: the exact location of the tunnel entrance, the layout of the basement, the number of children rescued from each floor. The FBI investigated and confirmed that St. Mary's had indeed been built on an old warehouse site, and that warehouse had been connected to Chicago's freight tunnel system. The tunnel entrance still existed in the ruins of the hospital, though it was sealed during the rebuilding. The FBI file on this incident contains a note from the investigating agent. While we cannot definitively prove Capone was involved in the rescue, the evidence suggests he and his men were the unidentified rescuers described in newspaper accounts. No charges can be filed as no laws were broken. Recommend case be closed. And it was closed. The FBI had more important things to pursue than investigating a gangster for saving children. One of the children rescued that night was a 7-year-old boy named Michael Rossi. Years later, as an adult, Michael became a journalist in Chicago. He never forgot the night of the fire, and he spent years trying to find out who saved him. In 1965, he published an article titled "The Man Who Saved My Life." In it, he described his memories of that night, being scared in a dark room, hearing a man's voice telling him not to be afraid, being carried through a tunnel by strong hands, emerging into the night air and safety. Michael wrote, I was too young to see his face clearly, but I remember his voice. It was firm but kind, and I remember thinking, even as a 7-year-old, that this man seemed important, seemed powerful. Years later, when I learned about Al Capone's tunnel system, when I heard the rumors about who really saved us that night,
I began to believe the impossible. That the monster Chicago feared was also the angel who carried me to safety. Epilogue, a complexity we struggled to accept. The
story of the hospital fire challenges our simple categories of good and evil. Al Capone was a criminal. He killed people, ran illegal businesses, corrupted officials, spread violence. But he also, on at least one night, risked his life to save 42 children he didn't know and would never profit from saving. These two truths coexist, and neither cancels the other. Capone's heroism doesn't excuse his crimes, but his crimes don't erase his heroism. He was both. He was complicated. He was human. Maybe that's the real story here. Not that a gangster saved children, but that humans are capable of both terrible and beautiful things, sometimes in the same lifetime, sometimes in the same person. Al Capone built an empire on illegal alcohol and violence. But when he saw smoke rising from a children's hospital, he ran toward it, not away. When he had a chance to use his criminal infrastructure for good, he took it. When he could have stayed safe and let someone else be the hero, he climbed into an inferno instead. Today, almost a century later, very few people know this story. It's not in the history books, not in the documentaries. If you visit Chicago and take a gangster tour, they'll tell you about Capone's crimes. They won't tell you about the 42 children, but maybe they should, because that night proved something important. Even in darkness, there can be light. Even in the heart of someone society calls evil, there can exist courage and compassion. And sometimes, when the moment demands it, even a gangster can be a hero.